Well, hello and welcome to Work Cookie, our weekly gathering of IOs, HRs, recruiters, and one actor as we try to make the world of work just a little bit better. And today we're going to continue, I think, we're going to conclude our discussion we've had with Tim Sharples all month on the law enforcement industry and how we improve the world of work there and what we can all learn from some of the advancements they're making. So, Tim, great to see you. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here. So I got an email yesterday as a direct result of all of the good work that we've done here at CBOC. I received an email yesterday. So if you remember week two, actually, I want to start by saying I hope the past 4 weeks, because this is the last week of the law enforcement segment, with the topics of spotlight, law enforcement specifically, and they've been a reflection on CBOC's mission to rally our IO community to improve all of our workplaces. So Dr. Rick Jacobs, if you remember from week two, was on the Leadership Podcast. So he's from Penn State, and he's the one that's coordinating the PSYOPs Memorandum of Understanding with the Department of Justice. So those of you who weren't there on week two, bam, you're caught up. So PSYOP, has said that it is a historic initiative because you have the Department of Justice that writes about $150 million worth of grants per year, and there's no IO influence on there. With Dr. Rick Jacobs working with PSYOP, they actually are getting some momentum, and part of that was due to our discussion. So I'm just going to quickly read what he had said. He just heard back a state policing agency, which will remain nameless for now. A lot of agencies are being written grants for psychological mental wellness, psychological safety, things of that nature, peer support, all those things that have to do with what you expect with mental wellness, but nothing for the workplace. So there is a grant. As part of the grant is written specifically for a state policing agency to have an IO psychologist assigned to their agency, not just to work at the psychological safety. And this is the part I have to read, so forgive me if I have to look at it. I'm old school, it's printed up here. The funded position is designed to help identify practices that could be implemented or removed to enhance the wellness of all personnel. So I will say our non-sworn people, as well as our sworn officers. I inserted that part. With a particular emphasis on leadership development, starting with informal leaders and first-line supervisors, such as sergeants, to cultivate their leadership skills as they advance their careers. That's verbatim from his email. How many conversations have we had either on this podcast or offline about leadership? And just how fitting is that he was week two, here we are week four, we're wrapping this up, that I got the email yesterday. So and that's all due to IO. And so if you are, again, I will say it again, if you're interested in helping out Dr. Rick Jacobs, I don't have his email with me. I posted it in week two's chat, or contact me. My information is in the chat this week. And I'll get in contact. It's signing up for the list. And as these grants are being written, more and more will start to have an IO psychologist to measure the improvement of the monies that are being spent. So that gets a big win.
Well, congratulations. And it's always great to know that we're doing more than just talking about things. Things are actually progressing and getting done. And hopefully we have as much success with our topic today. We're going to look at the recruitment revolution, leveraging IO psychology to attract and retain top talent in policing. And you've brought some special guests. So if you don't mind, Tim, I'm just going to give a brief bio of our guest today, and then we can start our conversation. Perfect. So with us today is Dr. Liz Koman. She is a senior personal psychologist with the Strategic Talent Management Division for the Department of the Interior's Office of Human Capital. Her responsibilities include hiring, assessment, and selection practices. These include the specialties of job analysis, competency, modeling, survey research, and using data to inform HR strategies and decisions. Liz began working with the federal government in 2001 and soon thereafter started conducting research for the Navy, helping to establish the Human Performance Center. And during her 18-year career with the Navy, Liz also worked with the Military Sea Lift Command, Navy Manpower Analysis Center, and Chief of Naval Operations. So, Dr. Koman, thank you very much for joining us today, and we're so happy to have you with us. We also have Dr. Heather McElroy and Dr. Michael Bricker. They're both managing partners at Psychological Dimensions with offices in Atlanta, Georgia, Chicago, Illinois, and Denver, Colorado. Together, Heather and Michael provided psychological risk management services to private and public sector clients, Heather since 2006 and Michael since 2009, for numerous civilian and law enforcement agencies around the country. Their focus is pre-employment screening, including especially assignment selections, fitness for duty evaluations, threat assessments, and post-critical incident management at the state, local, and federal levels. Liz, Heather, and Michael define their mission as supporting and enhancing the psychological health and performance of individuals and organizations that serve and protect the public. So thank you, Dr. Koman, Dr. McElroy, and Dr. Brick for joining us today. Great to have you with us. And Tim, let me send it back to you because I think you've got a topic discussion starter for us.
I do. But actually, I want to say just one caveat. So, after I was looking at the resumes, I feel like I've not done nearly enough with my life. I need to do more. I feel so far behind. But Liz, I've known as my mentor. We'll talk about that at some other point. But SEAL Fit is and I realized just how much that work with the Navy SEALs. I've taken a lot of leadership classes with them, and I did not know that about Liz too. So you learn something new about people every day. Good things. Anyway, so the first question I have, kind of a how we tie this all back to IO psychology, but specifically with law enforcement and reflecting in IO in general, is how are the police psychological assessments adapted to ensure candidates are not only mentally fit, but are also aligned with the organization's culture and values? And then,
and Dr. McElroy, let's go to you first.
Yeah, so as you were introducing Dr. Koman and talking about job analyses, that I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle, right? Because we don't know if somebody is suitable or not suitable unless we know specifically what job they're applying to do and for which department. We find that people who are a good fit in a larger city agency may not be the best at, say, working in a smaller, more family-friendly campus position. So it's really important for us to not only carefully consider the position, but also the culture of the agency to which they're applying, not only to make sure that this person does a good job, but to enhance retention across the lifetime of the officer.
Thank you for that. Dr. Koman, your thoughts?
Yeah, I fully agree with what Dr. McElroy was saying. At DOI, we have about 6,400 law enforcement officers across different series. We don't call them necessarily law enforcement officers, but we have things like park rangers or investigators or lots of different series. So exactly what Tim was asking about was finding that right fit for the job. And so a few years ago, actually, there was an executive order that got put in place in the federal government that that really implemented actually the use of secondary hiring assessments for any federal job. There's a few caveats, so I shouldn't say any, because of course there's never always absolutes, but for most federal jobs. And so what that is, for us, it's not just saying, hey, I would be good in that federal job. It requires that we have those secondary assessments where we assess, hey, that candidate would actually be a good fit in this job. And it's based off of that job task analysis and using a validated hiring assessment to make sure that they would have the right KSAs for that position. And so that is one way that we're doing it across the entire federal government, not just at DOI.
So Dr. Bricker, are we there yet? Or is this just the beginning of the journey and there's a lot more work to do with assessments and making sure we're getting the right people in the right positions?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think where we're headed is hopefully creating some but continually improving standards, I think, for how we do this type of evaluation. One of the things that we're looking at, not just in ensuring emotional stability, but is also looking at suitability factors, as Dr. McElroy and Dr. Koman were mentioning, that relate to things like social competence, flexibility, integrity, ethics, impulse control, assertiveness. So when we evaluate for a particular agency, we use that job description and some of these dimensions that we typically see as kind of integral to safety sensitive positions to understand goodness of fit, so that we're not just kind of ruling out emotional instability, but really ensuring that the person matches the skill set and kind of personality factors match the setting that they're going into.
Do you find when recruits are interested in coming into the police force that things like emotional intelligence are high on their radar, that they know that this is something that detachments and police forces will be looking for, or have they never even heard of the idea of emotional intelligence?
It's a great question. I think that is often, for all of us in the psychology sphere, much more part of our vernacular than it is for new recruits and things like that. However, it's not to say that they're not thinking about those things. Often in more practical terms, they think about response time, they think about receptivity to feedback, or community oriented policing, for example, in police settings. So I think all of those obviously overlap well with emotional intelligence. So we have to find that bridge, even in speaking with police administrators or other safety sensitive administrators, to help them understand what emotional intelligence means in practical ways.
Dr. McElroy, let me throw this to you, because I'm always fascinated with, if I wanted to become a police officer, or if I was a police force, should I be recruiting in my community locally, or do I want to know there's too close a connection with the community and I want to be recruiting from out of town?
That's a very interesting question. And I've worked a lot in Georgia, where a lot of my agencies were trying to recruit from New York, because I also work in New York. And historically, it's very difficult to get law enforcement jobs in New York because of the civil service testing, and it's a very long process. So people are recruiting from places like New York and Florida. I think it's more difficult for officers to deal with relocation, learning geographically the area that they need to patrol, culturally. I think it is good to have some diversity, but I think it probably, I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing retention is not as great when you're trying to move somebody across the country to take a position. I'd be interested to do a little research to figure that out. And I think it also probably depends on the motivation of the officer to move. Do they have family there? It's because we found that it's their connection with their department and their community and their family that really keeps them someplace. It's a lot more than money and benefits.
And how are we doing on recruitment? I mean, it's not going to be homogenous across the board, but generally in the United States, if you had to give a letter grade to the recruitment aspect in police forces today, what would that letter grade be?
I would probably give it a C- at this point, which is up from a D, which is where it was right after the George Floyd incident. I mean, recruitment in law enforcement was very difficult. When I do talks for chiefs and command staff, I ask them how many of them would recommend this job to their children, and they're not doing that. They don't want their children working in public safety. My personal opinion is that it doesn't pay enough for the work that it is. And there are, at this point, better jobs available in terms of pay. So people really need to want to do this work, and really be passionate about it for them to be easily recruited. Throwing money at it will help a little bit, I think, but I think culturally we really need to change the perspective of the position.
Yeah, I guess money is great, but it really depends on what you do with it.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that it's put in the right places. So, Dr. Koman, let me come back to you and ask, are we recruiting the right people? Are we going to be able to retain them, or are we still missing the boat when just comes to recruiting the right candidates?
That's a great question. And for the department, I don't have our exact numbers on retention because we have such a number of series involved in law enforcement. And I think our culture is a little bit different given the fact that our numbers, we have some police and we have some criminal investigators in our law enforcement series, but the bulk majority of our LEOs are park rangers. So the culture is very different. And for us, park rangers is probably one of our most sought after job series because just because of the culture and what they're doing. So it's a very different culture and different position. So for us, both recruitment and retention of a park ranger is a very different situation. But given the other series, our issues with recruitment and retention are similar for other series, I should say.
So do we need a brand new hiring manual, recruiting manual on how to actually find the right people?
I think looking at this series looking at this entire situation from an IO lens, I think a whole new IO refresh would be a very good strategy.
So what's the first step? Well, what's chapter 1 of that new manual?
Tom, I'd like to weigh in on that one. I believe it was the first episode on culture. The culture that got us where we are now will not get us into the future. And our culture needs to reflect the communities that we serve, much like we talked earlier about recruiting locally versus from other areas. The culture needs to change in how we represent ourselves in the community.
Well, let me ask you, Tim, because you've mentioned on previous podcasts that we need to go from that warrior mentality to the guardian mentality. But how do you sense that in a potential recruit? How do you find, how do you split those two up? Because I'm not sure I could, on my own, figure it out.
I love the question because it ties in so many things. So when you asked Heather about culture, there's the big city one versus the small city one. They're going to different cultures, but also, as the saying goes for leadership, the fish stinks from the head down. And when we're implementing President Obama's 21st century policing, the warrior versus guardian mindset was one of the topics that I tackled. And the chief executive at that time made it crystal clear that so the officers were using the word warrior and guardian as synonyms, and they're not. And so once we did a deeper dive on what needs to be a warrior, AKA an occupier, versus a guardian, a protector, the people on the panel that got it. The other folks, they had some debate and they would say, no, I'm always going to be a warrior, rah, rah, rah. And so those people that were very fixed on their opinion of not evolving the change in law enforcement, our chief executive said, let me be clear. This is happening. It is the right thing to do for the right reasons. And words matter. Even the smallest of words in air quotes matter. He said, I've been in law enforcement a lot longer than you have. He put on the big boy britches that day. I loved it. I've been in law enforcement a lot, and I am the chief. This is my department. If you feel that strongly about one word, warrior versus guardian, I don't always say do this, but he offered the door for them to go find those departments that are a better cultural fit because it wasn't happening at that department.
There you go.
Yeah, it was one of the difficult conversations that had to be had, but it was implemented and done very well.
Can you give me some examples of that change in culture, that police officers may be doing this today, but we really want them to do this?
I'll tie this back into Dr. Rick Jacobs' initial part of it, because I've always, even though I've been an IO student, I get it in theory. I was always kind of IO in nature because I wanted to see the things that worked, and but not pay just lip service to it. So I think most of us are familiar with community policing. back in the 90s, and with the old guard, the last week's episode, the OG, what we did before, what we didn't, and what we are doing now, they would say we have a community policing officer. Well, the newer mindset is we're all community policing officers. It's like saying in the 1990s, when a lot of the domestic violence laws were first being written in state laws, saying, well, we have a domestic violence unit. We're all domestic violence investigators because we're the frontline officers being called there. So it's about, again, setting that mindset and setting expectations. So that's what needs to change. So it's about going back to not paying lip service and asking questions and making sure, again, that the departments are doing right by the people that we serve.
Right. Dr. Bricker, I'd love to ask you, I imagine when a police force is looking to hire, they might even, create some advertisement, or at least they're putting the word out there. They're looking for people, so I'm a recruiter, all of a sudden I have 10 candidates in front of me. Is even the advertising and the call for more policing, are we attracting the right people at that stage? Or do we need to get out and say to the community, we are changing, here is the new type of police officer we're looking for?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I mean, I feel like that's so further down the chain, right? I mean, we obviously want to create good advertisement and things like that in recruiting. I think recruiting has to start, though, at a more foundational level. And the one way I think of this is through IACP's trust building campaign that they've been working on for the last several years. There's an understanding in the police administrator kind of setting that there needs to be a rebuilding of police's image after things like George Floyd and some of the other kind of horrific things that have happened. I think, building relationships with communities, and particularly communities of color and disenfranchised communities, becomes really important in that, right? I think we have to think about things within IACP. We've been talking a lot about minority mentorship and helping diverse individuals who are early career in policing see a path and develop a foundational self-efficacy that instills an ability to imagine themselves as leaders in the field, right? If I don't see a pathway for me, or don't see people like me in kind of leadership, I'm not going to believe I ever have a chance at a long career there. I think also just visibility in other atypical settings that normalize police. I think about Chicago here at the Pride Parade every year. They have a rainbow police car, and they have several police officers who are giving out things. They have a float of Chicago police officers that come through, and you wouldn't think of that in a normal kind of setting, maybe in a parade or something, but it does begin to help make police accessible and understand kind of that difference between that guardian mentality versus a warrior one that kind of the sound bites of the media give us a lot.
Thank you very much for that. And Emmy, I see you've got your hand up, and I'm so glad you do, because you have a foot in both of these camps. I mean, police officers quite well.
I do happen to know a couple pretty well, yes. And so I have a couple of questions. They're actually unrelated, so there may be some tie and link between them. And if not, you can answer whichever one, I guess, is more relevant to you. But one of the statistics that I recently read in a report from the International Association of Chiefs of Police was that 78% of departments are having difficulty recruiting anyway, which is a really huge number when you consider how many people or what areas that might cover nationally, right? So considering that, the first question I really have is, where are some of those trade-offs, or where are some of the relaxing happening on the disqualifiers, right, when you're recruiting or at point of recruitment, and how are those being determined? Because I know that is one strategy that's being used, at least locally here. And then the second question I have is related to a video that I saw recently, a robot that was a police robot that made an arrest at a hotel. And if you haven't seen this video, go check it out. It's very interesting. And I'm actually hoping to write a case study about something very similar. So it is in Lubbock, Texas. That robotic was employed to actually arrest someone. And ultimately it ended up, rolling the guy over, and then SWAT could come in and arrest the guy. But that begets the second question, which is, what technology considerations are happening at point of recruitment as well, knowing that police dogs are coming out, they're already there, and Houston has a police dog. There's robotics now that we've had our first arrest in Texas with a robotic. Is there consideration for the necessity of technology literacy or any other factors that are technology related that are happening in the recruitment area?
I'll start because I probably have the least depth of answers for you on these questions. So I'll start. I don't have the answers for the technology pieces. So, but from a hiring standpoint, with like the job analysis, my expertise would be with the critical factors, right? And looking at if you're hiring and you say, people are only meeting the 70% mark, or if you're the 80% mark, what you really need to be looking at is, let's just oversimplify this from an IO perspective. Here are things that police officers need, and here are the absolute critical ones, and then here's my nice to have, and then here's my good to have. Okay, I'm having a hard time recruiting, so the good to have, maybe I can train those things. Or what do I have to have when they come on board, and what can I train, and what can I train long term, and really sort of matrix some of these things out. But if these are my absolute critical, and they don't have them, then I need to come up with a better recruitment strategy, or I need to have a longer training pipeline, or matrix out what you can do, because you're absolutely critical to have. It doesn't matter if they don't have those, then you're going to have more George Floyd accidents, or you're going to have more incidences, and you don't give up on those criticals, but then you can give up on your nice to haves. And so that's where in the hiring situations, you have to make those decisions, and you have to put those critical things in place, and have better recruitment strategies, or networking events or cultural events, etc. But so from a hiring standpoint, that would be my input. I pass it to you.
It's interesting that you brought up the technology, because as we've been going to conferences, we are seeing these police dogs, and they're the robotic police dogs. It's crazy to me, the technology that people are using now. What I think is interesting about that is that the younger generation grew up with all of the technology. They like it. It's something that draws them to the department. So I think the more departments can start to use technology, the better they will be at recruiting the younger generation of people.
Oh, Dr. Bricker, we can't hear you there. I think something might be going on with your mic.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think these are all really good points. I would add to, there's been this push to give hiring and retention bonuses to, a lot of agencies have said, oh, we'll give a $30,000 bonus if you sign on. It's tricky though, right? Because we don't want people just signing on because they see some money and that don't have a real interest in police and public safety work. So I think we've really got to think about, strategically about who we're looking to recruit, how we do that, the spaces. Another place that I think is a really valuable place for police and other public safety individuals to be is in schools, kind of working with these cadet programs where students, kind of similar to some of the military cadet training, that gets people interested early on, that gets them exposed to, again, real world police and other public safety officials. Those are, we can't start recruitment right at the point of when we put the job listing up. And, I think that's an important piece.
Well, I'm glad you raised the high school because, as I'm sitting here, it's September. I'm a grade 12 student, just started my final year. Why would I think of going into policing? I mean, after all of our discussions, it doesn't seem to be very attractive.
Yeah. It fits also with this idea you were mentioning about how do we keep the right people. We don't want warrior mindset people coming in. We'll get candidates, for example, will say, well, I want to, do in those burglars and bad people, and things in that kind of idea, or they have these misperceptions from television about what they'll be doing when. And I think we have to educate and start that at an early age of what police do, what guardian mentality versus warrior mentality is. And then I think just also, kind of coming back to this piece about technology and its kind of fit with recruitment. A lot of police agencies, because of some of these defund movements and things like that can be misguided, end up having less budgets, right, for any of these things. And I think one of the cuts that we've been seeing is less emphasis on pre-screening, which is a problem, right? We want to make sure it's a small investment for a very important thing that has impacts on teamwork, on their ability to effectively police. So I think we've got to think, in a holistic way again about how we're funding police, where we're putting those monies, what's the best money spent, and technology as an adjunct to that.
I quite often notice that police are sent into situations where, maybe a psychologist would be a better fit. Do we need to start teaming them up, or do we need to start training police officers to be psychologists?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Colorado, we have several agencies that do a co-responder program where we have mental health professionals that go out with our police on calls involving mental health. It's been a very successful program. It's definitely led to a better understanding, helps us avoid these Sonia Macy type situations that happen here in Illinois, for example, where there's not an understanding of what mental health and mental illness is and how that impacts the things. So those are great programs. Again, we have to think about, I was talking with NBC News about this recently, that defunding the police means it impacts on that, right? If we don't have the right people going out with police, we're not going to be serving the community in the best way. So as much as that idea is something that has some merit in some way, where people's motivations are for that, it doesn't translate when we really think about what we're wanting to have policing look like in our communities.
I appreciate the work that all three of you are doing, and you as well, Tim, in trying to change this. And I can imagine that you are having some successes. You might work with one city and everything changes. It's a great success. But down the road, there's another city and they're not walking this path. They think that the way they're doing things is absolutely fine. How do you convert them? How do you get them on board?
That's a sticky wicket because you're talking about an entire nation, an area, but we all belong to the International Association of Chiefs of Police. So it's an accountability or peer support or peer influence to get your chief executives to do something to make the change.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another thing, I guess, just to speak to that, Tom, was this last year as chair in ICP's Police Psych Services section. One of the things I had the privilege of working with police administrators and section members on was passing a resolution within ICP that stresses that police agencies need to use the pre-employment screening guidelines that are put out by the association. And these are things that make real impact, because what it does is kind of sets a standard. So these resolutions now take the guidelines and give them teeth. And really, for police agencies, for example, that don't follow those, it could have very serious consequences, right? Not only the public holding them accountable, but could end up in situations with litigation. So I think for those agencies that are very receptive, obviously those are the ones that we like to see. But I think we have to think of all directions, right? We have to hold people accountable and create the measures of doing so.
Well, and also educating police leaders. A lot of them don't understand what the pre-employment process is all about. They don't understand how to use the pre-employment report. They don't know what type of professional to even hire to do the pre-employments. So in addition to setting some standards, I think educating people about the why, the how, the what, why is this important to you? How does this benefit you? It isn't just something that, we're not trying to control your hiring process. We really want to work with you to hire better people and retain people, which ultimately at the end of the day saves you a lot of hassle and a lot of money. And you get people who are really happy to be there. So just, yeah, that education piece is huge. So I'm actually working on trying to get more presentations out. I just went to the National Sheriff's Association. I've presented to the FBI National Academy Associates just to get leaders aware that, people don't even know the police psychology is a field. They're like, oh, I just sent them to a psychologist and they're a therapist. I'm like, well, police and public safety is a board specialty. And we have specialists who do this work specifically, and why it's important to use those people for this kind of work. I'm surprised every day at how people don't know what we do or that we even exist.
Let me ask you this, because we've talked a little bit about the difference between smaller communities and the major cities. And, I don't live in a major city. I live in a small community. I like it that way. And I'm wondering if my issues in small town are the same issues, especially when it comes to recruitment, that the big cities are seeing. Is there a commonality that we can all learn from? Or, are those unique? Is maybe even every police organization unique because of the community that they're in?
Tom,
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
so personal experience on that one. When I tell my personal story about, starting in 1990, for my little hometown, we had 12,000 people population. So that's a small town. For one opening, we had 350 applicants. Nice problem to have in 1990. And that's what eventually caused me to leave the state of Massachusetts and go and start in Florida, because as they were laying off in Massachusetts, to Heather's point about recruiting in New York, because of the civil service system, it's difficult to get roles in the Northeast. So they go south, and that's where I got my start in Florida. But even in states such as Georgia and Florida, they too are having issues. So it's difficult, big or small. It's an overall image issue because of what we see in the general news media. And also, again, I'll go back to the culture. It's not, the profession needs to change and evolve if we are to stay relevant. And we have to be relevant because it's a profession that just cannot be eliminated or go away. We've seen how that doesn't work out. So we as the IOs and the professionals that care about policing need to be the voice to make this change happen, or these changes happen.
Mm-hmm. I think Dr. Koman, is focused there on the job descriptions and job analyses. I mean, those are some of the pieces, right, of understanding exactly what this job entails. We see this with like Federal Reserve Bank, for example, like people who are guarding money all day and have zero contact with, others socially. We don't want somebody who's very extroverted and working in that type of setting. Is just not going to be a good fit, versus agency like the Chicago Police Department that's very dynamic, that requires a very broad-based skill set. So I think those job descriptions, I think Dr. McElroy also covered an important point about geographic location and culture, even in that respect of like, we've seen this with some of the ski cities in Colorado, for example, where it's a very type of different policing that goes on in those spaces, and just even living in those communities, what that means versus being in Denver or another setting. So I think we have to think about those pieces. And to Tim's point, understanding kind of cultural factors that create a sense of safety. Like I think about an agency recently that was bringing on a transgender officer, and we were discussing, putting them in touch with some police administrators who had experienced kind of recognizing what ways that they could build culture that is sensitive and attentive to those types of issues. So I think there's a lot of different angles to this.
Thank you. And Dr. Koman, I'd love to ask you this, because we often talk about the job description and how bad they are today, that they really don't, tell you much about the job you're going to be taking. So how are we doing in the police industry when those recruitment calls come out and there's a description of the position? Is it accurate?
Yeah. I think there's probably room for improvement on any job series, in almost any organization, unfortunately. But hey, that's good job security for IOs, right? And working with our HR practitioners across the field, and I think that's something that we all strive for. But unfortunately, it seems that most job descriptions and job announcements probably all could use a little bit of improvement across the board.
They're just as bad as everywhere else, huh? Well, thank you for that.
How many times, I was going to say, to add to Liz's comment, how many times have we in the government or with work for the government have seen and other assorted job responsibilities? It's just that catch basin that's actually most likely bigger than your actual job description.
Yeah, I took one of those jobs. I think it was 90% of my job was and duties as prescribed. Tim, we got about 15 minutes left, and I know that you had a few questions that you wanted to pose to our guests.
Well, Ed, here's an awesome job between Emmy's question and some of the others. It covered a lot of the questions that I had, but here's one that I think ties back to what IOs in general, but also public safety is looking at. What are the common assessments or surveys that you utilize that share linkages between law enforcement and the other industries out there that are assessing traits like leadership, stress tolerance, or interpersonal skills? Are there several surveys that are kind of like that kind of have a foot in both worlds?
So from the police and public safety side, those types of traits and characteristics we typically measure with the California Personality Inventory, which measures normal personality characteristics. What's really interesting about that particular test is that it's used in the normal population. So we can get norms to see how someone compares to just standard population, but also with police and public safety positions. So police officer, firefighter, dispatcher, all of those positions, paramedic. So it allows us to see how someone also tests compared to other people who've been successful in that job for at least a year. So that's at least one measure that we use across both populations that measures normal personality traits and characteristics. The 16PF is another one that measures a lot of normal traits and characteristics, stress tolerance, bias, things like that. And then as in terms of psychopathology or psychological problems, the PAI and the MMPI both have, again, community norms and police and public safety norms. So they're tests that really are used across populations and are very specific to what we're trying to assess.
Yeah, it's an integral part of the pre-employment guidelines for psychological evaluation for police and public safety personnel to rely on those types of tests. And again, I think that, this is something we've found as a national company, that there's so many providers out there who really don't know these tests exist, know these norms exist. A lot of police administrators will look for someone in their community, a generalist psychologist, and refer them hoping that they're going to be doing the right work. So I think this is where, again, things like IACP, the American Board of Professional Psychology, and Police and Public Safety, those types of resources become essential to making sure we're doing best practice in this, because there are inventories that, again, are normed for these different types of jobs, which becomes really important, right? We can look at a general profile and everything looks okay. But if we really look at, like Heather said, if we compare them against norms of other officers who complete the job for a year and don't get terminated, wow, do you see some differences in how this person performs against those people? So I think that's something we just want to get better and better at assessing, how this person stacks up against other successful officers, firefighters, dispatchers, correctional officers, things like that.
Yeah, at the department or at the federal level, we are required to use validated assessments, and so at the department we have numerous bureaus aligned to the department, and so they are allowed to use different assessments as long as they're valid and reliable. Right now, I'm aware that most of the bureaus are using a tool that is owned and maintained by the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. And so that tool is USA Hire. So there might be others right now, but I'm not aware of any of those. So USA Hire covers a lot of different job series. The ones in our the main ones in our law enforcement series that I know it covers is our park rangers. I don't believe at this time that it covers our police or our criminal investigation series, but I do know it covers our park rangers for a number of GS levels. And so it is considered a valid and reliable assessment. So within that, it looks at a number of different components that have been mapped to the job task analysis for a park ranger to be successful as a park ranger.
And we've got other measures too, kind of building upon that. I think for assessing emotional stability, for example, the MMPI 3 now and the PAI, which are both have norms, at least applicant norms, and the PAI has incumbent norms for us to also compare how this person performs against others who, successful applicants, things like that. So again, I think those well-validated measures, as Dr. Koman was mentioning, become really important understanding. And this is why I think psychologists play a unique role in this type of, screening. Psychologists have specialized, as we all know, specialized training in assessments and statistics and things like that, have a good understanding of research and what it means to use valid instruments, which is very important as we start to think about, who's doing these types of evaluations.
Tim, do you have another question?
I see Emmy had her hand up first. I had a follow-up, but so that's Emmy's got her hand up first.
Well, let's go to you, Emmy.
Oh, sure. I'm just listening here a little bit and made me start thinking about kind of comparing this industry, which is a very unique job. We've talked about that in a previous podcast on this series. A very, very unique role to any other role. But when you think of organizations, engagement and performance is a really big part of the conversation. And oftentimes the employees are elicited, for feedback in this point. So I hear a lot of conversation happening about assessing and looking at the role and looking at the job description and measurements, but I haven't heard a lot of conversation about inviting the officers and the personnel from the department into the conversation. So I wonder, where is that happening, or where are the opportunities to include the actual people that are working in that conversation?
So when we do a job analysis, we're doing that job analysis with the subject matter experts within that department. So we're having a very detailed conversation I like to invite at least 5 people, one from HR, one from training, one in a command staff position, so that they are all giving their own personal input. And then we're taking that data, collaborating the data, and coming up with a mean for each of the characteristics that we're asking them to rate. So I think it's very important to have those conversations directly with the department that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. I think kind of related to that too, we also at our company, for example, do include training and supervision recommendations in our report. So one thing that we saw when we, Heather and I started doing this work, is a lot of these evaluations were basically just pass fails, like does the person meet basic benchmarks, which is important, which is an essential piece to it. But I also think one of the things we've incorporated over time is understanding relevance to different variables and how they might play out on the job. So these training and supervision recommendations, for example, let's say someone has some difficulties with assertiveness, not disqualifyingly so, but issues maybe with building their social competence or other types of things. Maybe they've got a little bit of abrasiveness in their personality. We try to inform field training officers, academies, things like that, personnel, to how do we help this candidate succeed? What are some directions that we can go with helping them in the process of training and supervision? So I think helping rework a little bit of the way we thought about pre-employment evaluation and its usefulness to police administrators.
And I mean,
Yeah.
I think I heard something. Oh, sorry, Liz, go
No,
ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
So I mean, I also heard something different as well, because having been on the receiving end of the battery of assessments, what I heard is it's not just here's some assessments. All right, you're done. See ya. There's also an interview with the job applicant. So they have a conversation with the applicant as well to give the answers that they're giving on these MMPIs, all these other assessments, some context, which is to me, that I love the surveys. I think they're amazing, but it's the one-on-one interviews that really make a complete picture.
That's a great point, Tim. And I think it's educating as well, those who are going through the screening process, and even employees in a fitness for duty context. Like, we really need to do a better job, I think, of educating what this is and isn't. An example of this is a lot of new candidates who are coming in for police work have been seeking mental health services, right? And we never want that to be perceived as something that's a negative. So we've developed even a script for all of our psychologists to make sure that, especially if they have some history, that we have a way to kind of communicate to the candidate, this can be a very good thing. This doesn't mean you're going to get disqualified for those issues, and it can actually be a really show of resiliency that you sought out help. So I think helping them understand this isn't a punitive process. And same with employees who are going through fitness for duty evaluations. That's a very scary thing, to have some mental condition happening that maybe takes them away from the job. And so helping them understand that a fitness for duty process is meant to formalize a process for them of getting help, of ensuring they're ready and going to be able to be successful and going back to work, so that we don't set them up for failure. So I think those are great points of me of, educating and bringing people in, not keeping this cards too close to the chest where people feel scared or misunderstanding of the process.
And
Hey, Tim,
Liz,
Liz, go ahead.
Liz,
Oh, no, well, I think the conversation took a little bit of a turn, but regarding the feedback from the assessments, I think from a department standpoint, across our department, when we implemented and we had this huge change, there was a lot of feedback that we received because it was a new process and a new change. But the feedback that we received long term, initially it was hard, like any cultural change. I think as IOs, we all know cultural change is hard and people have a huge resistance to it. But after the change was implemented and we've watched it for a few years, we've actually had positive change from it. So the initial people who are initial applicants kind of had a resistance because it was new and it was time consuming and they didn't want to do it. But after they did it, and then HR got used to it, hiring managers got used to it, the feedback that we got long term was that they were getting better people's names on certificates of potential applicants, and then the people they actually got in the job were better hires. So it was better people in the seats rather than just people, so the selection process was working. And so long-term feedback in that sense was really good. And so we did independent evaluations of the process, very positive all around, no negative effects from the process. So other feedback, external as well, and then long-term. So going through it, really, really tough. Cultural change, tough, as would be expected, but the long-term feedback that we've had has been very positive.
Thank you very much for that. And Tim, we've just got a minute or two left, but since we're talking about recruitment, and this is a journey that IO psychologists are taking, which is still relatively new. We didn't leave the start gate that long ago, and I'm thinking about all those IO psychology grad students. Maybe they're looking for a dissertation topic. Maybe they're looking for a path for their career. So why don't you recruit me? Why do I, as an upcoming IO psychologist, why is this a journey that I want to join you on? Or what would make me an ideal candidate to join this journey?
As Gandhi said, be the change you want to be the change you want to see in the world. I'm hoping I'm attributing that to the right person. So if not, it's Oprah.
It's an incredible opportunity to make real change. That's how I think of it. I remember, giving a presentation at IACP a couple of years ago with the head of Department of Homeland Security on assessing transgender officers. And I was thinking, wow, police administrators are here. They care that, we're making an impact on, reshaping kind of attitudes and ideas about kind of how we help and reach out to the communities that are diverse around us. And I think, being able to have impact on implicit bias and how we assess for that, making sure that we are really making a difference in reshaping communities and trust in the police and public safety personnel that are accessing those communities. I mean, what better opportunity, and outcome data that we get from agencies. We're sitting on a mind of that. It's great research, right? To be able to follow these officers and find out who gets terminated, who gets eliminated for use of excessive force. We can then go back and see what test scores shape up with that. I mean, it's exciting, the things that we can do to help reshape our communities.
And Tom, to recruit you into IO, one of the things was we're making the workplace better one at a time. And you talk to any of the veteran IOs and they'll say, oh, making the workplace better. And if we keep that spirit going, it's going to get better. Actually, for the first time, you can probably see behind me, the word hope is up there. As I wrote my dissertation, I literally had to put that up there because it is so easy to go down a negative rabbit hole of some of this. And so I know we need to wrap up. And so if you give me just a brief second, because it kind of ties it all together. So as we wrap up this podcast, I would be remiss I want to give my most heartfelt and sincere thanks to our incredible guest, Dr. Heather McElroy. If you are switching on my screen, I hate that. Dr. Heather McElroy. Dr. Michael Bricker, there you are, and Dr. Liz Koman. They'd be remiss to not to say to have this moment to share something both personal and meaningful. Heather is the one that got me started down my IO psychology path. So for all of you who talk to Tom about talking recruiting, Heather got me started down this path at the very beginning. Liz was my mentor, or is my mentor, and she is been very, very understanding. And I just want to say it's a reminder that our actions, even at the most random of moments, like going out to lunch and saying, Tim, you can be a psychologist, can have a profound impact on others. So I also want to conclude and say, lastly, many, many, many thanks to Jeremy and CBOC for generously granting me access to this platform to talk about this very, very vital topic that IO psychology can have an impact on. And I also want to end by saying, Tom, thank you for staying on as MC and keeping us all on track.
An absolute pleasure, Tim. And you've been an absolutely fabulous guest last month. Thank you very much for bringing this topic to our attention and creating access points for IO psychologists to get involved in, once again, an expanding field. And, as Jeremy says, the oldest profession in the world that you've never heard about, IO psychology. And here we are now, we're spreading the word. And every time someone like yourself comes on as a guest, who's not an IO psychologist, even I can learn how much the field is expanding and how important it is. Going through my career in work, HR was not the most trusted part of the organization. And it never seemed to fit with what people were saying HR was and what it really was. That thing that they were talking about that HR was supposed to be, that's you guys. That's the IO psychologists, the people. So thank you very much. It's been a great month. And an open invitation to yourself, Tim, and our guest today, Dr. Koman, Dr. Bricker, and Dr. McElroy. Anytime you would like to join us on Work Cookie, please just, if you've got a Thursday at noon where you're not doing anything, grab a sandwich, a cup of coffee, and join us on Work Cookie. Tim, thank you very much. Emmy, thank you as well for your comments today, and everyone who participated. Great month. Let me do a quick little check here and see where we're going to be going next week. See if Jeremy's posted anything. We've had a chat, but I don't think he's posted anything yet. So I'll let him do the surprise about what we're going to be talking about next month.
The mystery episode.
Yes. Tune in for the mystery episode next week. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, guests, as well. Thank you, participants. Absolutely fantastic. Great conversation as always. And we will see everyone back here in 7 days' time for our next episode. So, Tim, if you want to count us out, it's time to say goodbye.
3, 2, 1. Bye, y'all. Thank you all for being here.